beg your guys' indulgence because I'm having some real bad throat issues today, but I'm going to try and push through this episode. I only have a page of comments, so who knows, this will probably be another half-hour little tidbit. This is one of the very, 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 very few three-parters that exist in Star Trek. All of the existing three-parters that exist in Star Trek are not official three-parters. As a result, they don't get a lot of the benefits that three-parters normally would. That being said, every time they do a three-parter or a four-parter or whatever like this, it's generally considered to be a good thing because of the way... It's literally Star Trek doing a minor thing of string continuity. Story into story into story. And they can usually do some fun stuff with this. And this is no exception. Scorpion into Scorpion 2 into Gift is an excellent three-parter. Best of Both Worlds, Best of Both Worlds 2, and Family is another three-parter. And there are several other examples. There's the 4 or so episodes. Or is it 5? There's a string of episodes in Deep Space Nine where they basically put the normal show on hold to really do just war episodes where they did a similar vein kind of a thing to this. Not that uncommon, but also not that common at the same time. I only mention it because imagine what it would be like if they didn't do that here. Imagine if they did that back in TNG. Imagine if the next episode after Best of Both Worlds Part 2 was just, back to normal life. No. They insisted, and I agree, with doing Family to really stress just what happened to Jean-Luc Picard and the world and how terrible things were. They really, really insisted on doing The Gift after Scorpion Part 2, because of course they did. Seriously, imagine how, I mean, okay. I think we can all agree Scorpion was a great episode, right? Yep, hands up. Everyone? Okay. Wait, you don't think Scorpion was a good episode? Burn the heretic! I'm kidding. I've actually never encountered anyone who said they thought Scorpion was a bad episode. True story. But imagine if after Scorpion, and after that high of that amazing, intense, yeah, this is great, next episode acts like it never happened. Just normal Voyager episode after that. No Borg crap, no issues going on with Kes, no 7 of 9. Imagine what that would have been like. I'm starting to call this concept the Mass Effect 3 trend. It's basically the punch you in the balls idea. Something that several rather well-known writers, Tolkien, excuse me, are well-known for doing. Keep in mind there's a difference between a punch in the gut and a punch in the balls. A punch in the gut, sometimes known as a player punch, is, oh god, no! You know, like what happened at the end of, towards the end of Serenity. I'm not going to say it just in case there's actually people out there who haven't seen that movie yet. That was a this. A punch in the balls is when it's basically an out-of-character thing of, oh my god, what are you doing? Like, for example, if they just went to the next episode and there was no 7 and there was no continuity whatsoever, no consequence. That would be a ball punch rather than a gut punch, okay, just to clarify my terms here. So I'm really glad they decided not to do that, especially since several really good episodes later on in this show, and I'll talk about them when we get there, basically do exactly that. They have some big event happen and then it never happened. Really weird, but I digress. I got a lot of stuff to go through. I'm going to make a point to just go down the list in order, because this is, you know, I write this in order as the episode's playing. Obviously, I'm making notes while it's playing. Some of you who caught my live Empire Strikes Back rumination kind of know how that goes. I literally smash the pause button, get the pen out, and just and I'm back into it. And I actually kind of liked that I showed that off to you guys, just because you can see the kind of energy I put into this show sometimes. It's like, yeah, okay, notes. Okay, now what? Because when I have analysis mode on, my mind just goes a billion miles an hour. There's a very sticky ethical situation with 7 in this episode. I mentioned this as my second point because... And I'll be talking a little bit more about the details of this as we go, but there's no denying the fact that 7 is a unique situation. I mentioned this in brief before with regards to her relation to Hugh and Locutus, or rather Hugh and Picard, but she really is kind of a unique situation. This is someone who has always basically been Borg, who barely has memories of being a human. Ethically speaking... And I credit the writers because they did this on purpose. They made a big deal about, you know, in interviews how they wanted to make this a gray situation. Janeway is not correct in what she does, but then choosing to allow 7 to go back to the Borg is also not correct. We are given two bad options: so the ethically ambiguous and the morally despicable. The former being going ahead and forcing this person to undergo treatment against their will, and the latter being sending them back to the wolves. By the way, a quick note, they actually worked a lot on that wolf analogy, believe it or not. And I mentioned that with a degree of amusement because you probably didn't even notice the wolf analogy that happened in this episode. I mentioned this because the original analogy was that she was a recovering drug addict who also happened to be part of a cult. And that's the original analogy they were going with. And they decided that was way too negative, and Rick Berman stepped in and said, "Not in my Star Trek!" So instead they decided to try and tone that down a bit and came up with the wolf pack thing, which actually, in all honesty, does work pretty well, so credit where credit is due here. But I mention this because, I mean, I could literally just sit here and talk with you for like an hour about the ethics of forcing Seven to undergo treatment in this situation. Because there really is no right answer here. There really is no definitive, at least not from my perspective, I should add that. From my opinion, there is no definitive, this is the turning point, this is the decision point. Well, it's gray and gray, but blah, so we'll choose this side, you know? That's how a lot of gray versus gray things go for me, personally. One thing sticks out more than the other, so I lean in that direction, even though I acknowledge it's not really a better option. In this case, I can't think of anything really like that other than the obvious, aka being a part of the Borg. I'll talk more about that in a moment. I'm going to go down the list, just like I said I was. So, let's talk about Harry and Kes. I've been saying I was going to talk about this for a while. Why am I talking about Harry in this episode? To this day, it's been over a decade and a half since this episode came out. To this day, we still don't know 100% why things happened the way they happened. Why was Kes kicked off the show? Why was Harry kept on the show? Why did they add in Seven to the show at this point in time? You know, there's a lot of details about this that we still don't know. But you noticed I mentioned, why was Harry kept on the show? The reason that question is being asked at all, if you look at the interviews and whatnot, nobody even mentions the possibility of getting rid of Harry Kim, and yet there's a lot of evidence to indicate that they were going to. The structure of the stories, the way they were writing, the fact that there were several drafts to Scorpion, and a few little tidbits from a couple of the writers, which I'm not going to get into details. I don't feel like listing my sources, so feel free to look it up for yourself. Because, again, this is not set in stone. This is all speculation. But based on several things the writers said, based on the way it was structured, it seems pretty clear that Harry was the one who was going to leave, not Kes. The fact that the original intent was to... one of those writer things I mentioned is the original intent walking into the season ender was, we want to kill off a main cast member. Now that quickly turned into killing off Kes, and then they decided to do something that was kind of a wonderful send-off. And I'd just like to take a moment and say, this is how you do a send-off, Star Trek. Not what you did with Tasha the first time, okay? Now, I know, you learned your lesson, Star Trek, because then you gave Tasha her second send-off, and that was amazing. So I know you learned your lesson, but I just feel like pointing this out, because I'll be talking about this when it comes to TNG as well. Killing off a main cast member... Overall, I'm actually in favor of that idea. If you really kill them off for real and make it permanent, you know, the consequences matter. There's a degree of significant continuity that affects. The amount of character development that can develop from that is amazing. The impact it can have on the setting is amazing. Babylon 5 did this several times as well. I'm not naming names here because I know some of you haven't watched Babylon 5 yet or are waiting for me to go through that. But the point is, you do that kind of a thing. If you're going to do it right. Don't pull a Threshold. Don't ever do that. Threshold is probably the worst possible example of that, but that being said, and that's because he came back like a scene later, but the worst example of killing off a character for real is probably what they did with Tasha Yar. There's no denying this. And I'll talk about that more when we get later. I only wanted to mention it because, in my opinion, this was a genuinely good send-off for Kes. A lot of attention and focus of the story was on her, and this is really in many ways the fulfillment of her character arc. She has always been an explorer. She has always been someone who wants to reach out and see what's behind the next curvature of the hill, you know. She's always wanted to see what's just past that rock. And she's always been the kind of person who has this sort of analytical and calculating mind to be able to do that without... It's a different type of exploration. There's a difference between caution to the wind, just go, which some characters personify, and her, which is carefully and calculatingly making her way in you know, it's a different perspective. And this fits into that beautifully. I'll be talking more about her in a little bit, but I bring this up because one of the other tidbits here is that Harry almost died In fact, the original, we do know this, the original first or second draft, I forget which, there are like 5 drafts, of the script of Scorpion Part 1 actually did have Harry Kim dying. He was going to be eaten alive by the Undine cells, which is also really a horrible way to go, and for reference, not a good way to send a character off. There's also the undeniable fact that the writers, directors, and producers of Voyager were, in their own words, not putting words into their mouth, bored with Harry Kim. It is not until the rare exceptions of a few episodes, which will be happening later in this season, actually, when we get to the Killing Game, that they took Harry and actually did something with his character. And then he became more interesting, and then they started doing more stuff with his character from that point on, leading to some of the better Voyager episodes, in my opinion. Go figure, they actually used a character they had, and it became good. What a shock. I'm sorry. It just irritates me because they wanted to get rid of him because they couldn't think of anything to do with him. I mentioned one of the big reasons why this is before. To summarize in brief, for those of you who don't watch this whole series as we go, Harry Kim was a bullet point. He had an interesting beginning possibility for characterization, and then they abandoned that, basically, immediately, and never came up with anything new. He never had any direction. He never had any possibility of plot arcs. He had no actual characterization. And that's the problem. It wasn't until the Killing Game when he finally actually got a character. And it was awesome, I feel like pointing out. And that's when Harry Kim finally started being a character, as opposed to just, well, a bullet point, to be blunt. So there was a lot of disinterest in Harry Kim, which, by the way, I feel so bad for Garrett Wong for that. He was so maligned through so much of it. He put up through so much crap in this frickin' series. It's no wonder he was actually really enthused about coming back for Star Trek Online, I might add, because he actually enjoyed the role. He actually, when Jerry Ryan, I keep thinking I'm saying her name right, because there's Jerry Taylor, and then there's another Ryan person involved with Voyager. But anyways, when 7 of 9's actress was coming out of the show, the actor who most worked with her off the set, the actor who most welcomed her and made her feel part of the show and part of the family, who really got her to open up to the rest of the cast, was Garrett Wong. Think about that for a moment. Garrett Wong, and if you've ever seen the guy in real life, he's just this really happy-go-lucky kind of, everything's cool, gets along with everyone kind of guy, which is funny considering the character he plays. So yeah, he was the one who actually opened her up and was the gateway character for her to actually get along with the rest of the cast. And I just find that interesting because it says something about the kind of person Garrett Wong is, that despite the fact that his character was getting stepped on, and it's very likely, if this speculation is correct, that Harry was going to be the one kicked off the show, he was doing this in spite of knowing that. There's a couple of problems with why Harry Kim was not kicked off the show. Or I shouldn't say problems, that's not what I mean by that. There's a couple of speculations as to why. I'm getting my words confused here. The most obvious one is the one that's been repeated a few dozen times, which I will now repeat to get that up to an even 13, because 13 is a nice even number. And that is the fact that he was named one of the most beautiful people in Hollywood, in the show business and whatever, by people. I'm not a good judge of male attractiveness for reasons that should be obvious given my personal preferences, but I have to admit that I don't really see that as a vindicating reason to keep a character on a show that the directors and producers and writers themselves have admitted they find boring. I also have to wonder why they didn't take that as a sign of, well, if we're going to keep him, why don't we actually do something with him? But I'm getting off topic again. I'll actually be talking about Harry Kim more when we get to Year of Hell, believe it or not. So they had to keep Harry. So they decided who else could they axe? Well, Janeway was off the list because of contract reasons, and Tuvok was off the list because of contract reasons, and Chakotay was off the list because I'm not sure why. It would actually have been very interesting if they killed off Chakotay. Now, I can kind of see the rationale. It would be like killing off Riker, and that's probably what they were literally thinking, except that's not what it would have been like. Really. It's actually hard to come up with a TNG equivalent, but the idea here is that it would have been like, Riker was a fully fleshed out, really well-developed character. Chakotay was a barely fleshed out, barely developed character. Now, no offense to Robert Beltran, as I've talked before, that is not his fault. When he is allowed to shine, he does. And he has been in the last several episodes. Scorpion Part 2 really was his episode when it comes down to it. And yet, he it seems like a logical and interesting choice to axe him, especially in some kind of way that ends up, doing this sort of heroic sacrifice thing, which is usually a big hit if you pull it off properly. Because that's very in character for him. He does strike me as the commander who would lay down his life in a second without hesitating, as I've been emphasizing over the past few episodes, if it meant the salvation of his crew, because that's the kind of commander he is. It may not even be the right call, necessarily, but that's not the part that matters. It's very him, right? So they couldn't axe him because... and not that I wanted him off the show, let's make that clear. And they couldn't get rid of the Doctor because... And for once I agree with this, getting rid of the Doctor at this point would have been tantamount to suicide. Of all the characters, axing the Doctor would have been terrible. They couldn't get rid of Tom Paris because this isn't The Walking Dead. Now, to explain what I mean a little bit, Tom Paris, even when this show was coming out live, was one of the most beloved characters on the show. Him and the Doctor were basically the characters that were really, really well liked, up until Seven supplanted both of them. And getting rid of a character like that has a great deal of dramatic potential, but you have to be really, really careful with killing off a beloved character in order to make it a gut punch and not the other kind of punch, right? And it's also worth noting that Voyager, at this point, had basically just finally started to find its own. From this point on, Voyager will actually be basically good from now until the atrociously bad series finale. And so sacrificing all that goodwill in the face of that is something that could have worked, but it was a gamble. You see, from a production standpoint, from a writing standpoint, that is a risk. It might work, but it might also lose you all the goodwill that you've been slowly building up and having so much trouble getting over the past 3 years. And that's the kind of thing I can understand them not wanting to risk. So while killing off Tom would be on the table, I could see it being removed from the table pretty quickly. So who does that leave us with? Well, we can't get rid of Harry Kim because he's attractive. And we can't get rid of B'Elanna Torres because she's the only one who actually knows engineering. And we kind of have a plot arc already mapped out for her. Kind of one of the same reasons for not getting rid of the Doctor, I might add. So, who's that leave? You see where this is going. The only character, when you really logic it out, in my opinion, there were only 2 characters you could have killed off and really had... Oh, I didn't mention Tuvok. No, he had contract reasons. That's right. God, never mind. So, there really are, logically speaking, from a production standpoint, real-life perspective, as a writer, there's only 2 options for killing off a character. Chakotay and Kes. And between those 2, it is kind of obvious to see why they went with Kes. If I can talk about Kes a bit more for a bit... Ugh, and have more back pain going on. I love back pain. It's a shame because it's one of those catch-22... not catch-22, it's a self-fulfilling situation. I was right because I made myself right. One of those kind of things, right? In other words, Kes was considered for axing because they hadn't done anything with her character. Well, okay, I'm saying this in the wrong order. Kes was considered for axing because nothing, there wasn't much of a character there for people to be well established in, and she was basically a C-list cast member at this point. And the reason she was a C-list cast member and didn't have much of a character is because they hadn't done anything with her. And so they themselves are the reason why Kes was considered so low tier and therefore worthy of being axed. Again, they did a good job of it. They made this feel like a genuine departure, even though she had been lowering in importance over the last several episodes, of last season, really. And, well, you may have noticed that I deliberately left a cast member off the list that I was just going through. Kes or Chakotay, right? There is one other cast member that they could have axed. Neelix. A lot of people think Neelix should have been the one to actually leave the show in this episode, rather than Kes. Believe it or not, I am not one of those people. Here's the reason why. Neelix... Ethan Phillips is a great actor. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Neelix is an incredibly badly written character, and it's so rare they actually do something with his character. And to be honest, they're not actually going to do much of anything with his character from this point onward. So he is going to remain a C-list cast member, basically from this point on. However, getting rid of Neelix doesn't have nearly the kind of potential for gravitas that it does Kes. Why? Because it's killing off the comic relief. if you kill off the comic relief, that can have potential if you're going for that stark contrast. But that only works under very specific circumstances, and it's very hard to pull off properly. And, while I'm on the subject, if you're going to do something like that, you need to have some groundwork laid. And there needs to be some reason why he's dying, right? Other than... And really, Neelix has had so little to do with anything, it would have come out of left field. It would have felt a little bit too non-sequitur. In fact, if I can be blunt, it would have been a little bit too much like what happened to Tasha Yar. So, character that most of the crew and... Well, not the crew, I'm saying that wrong. Character that most of the audience doesn't care about up at this point in time, being removed from the show for basically mundane reasons, that doesn't work. I wanted to mention him separate and segregated because I wanted to address that concern specifically. In my opinion, as a writer, director, producer, whatever you want to call me, creator, I would disagree with axing Neelix, especially at this point. There's no... And I've already given my reasons why. Now, the other thing I want to talk about here is the obvious question. Why kill off a cast member? Now, I only have speculation on this. Because if you think about it, once they reached the point where they decided not to kill Harry Kim, from a real-life perspective, it should have been easy to say, okay, well, we just won't kill anyone off. The end! And off they go into the sunset. But that's not what they did. They insisted on maintaining the kill cast member idea. Why? The obvious answer is my speculation. Budget. Even for a character who only shows up infrequently, like Kes is, thanks to the way Hollywood contracts work, she was still making a decent amount of money, despite having relatively few appearances throughout the course of the show. So, removing her... For those of you who are not aware of how accounting really works, when it comes to budget, this has actually been reversing slowly over the years, but especially at this point in time, in the 90s, and this is true even in modern day when it comes to non-entertainment industries. If you look at the budget, if this is all of the money you spend, okay, all of the expenditures you have in your company, usually about this chunk, often more, this huge, huge chunk, like 40% up to like 80% of your budget is going to become solely from salaries. How much you pay the people who work for you. That is a huge, huge, huge expenditure. It has always been one of the biggest expenditures. And only in rare cases is it not in the modern era. Usually because of the special effects situation. Yet that's kind of a niggle room, because technically the reason special effects are so expensive is because you're paying people to do those special effects. So again, actually this still applies when you think about it literally as opposed to from an accounting perspective. I'm getting off topic. The point being, in a 90s show, sci-fi show especially, chopping a person from the budget means removing a significant portion of what you're spending every week, which leaves more for a new person to join the show, like they did with Seven, leaves more, and that's kind of the end of that statement, because I mentioned, this is key, okay, remember this, I mentioned they got an overall budget increase for Season 4, and that's a good thing, and they could have used that to just add on 7 of 9, and basically keep the same general quality of effects, set design, costumes, etc. throughout Season 4. And I think they didn't want to do that. I think the people were really thinking Voyager had finally hit its stride, and they were right. And they wanted to really push it to do better. And that is kind of Season 4 in a nutshell. We're pushing to do better. And they did a lot of stuff in Season 4, a lot of branching out in Season 4. And so they went ahead and axed a cast member for money. However, it is worth noting that that is more the blame on the studio that was allotting them that budget than it was the actual writers and producers. So that's just my opinion and speculation. As ever, feel free to yell at me and tell me I'm stupid. I don't even know how long I've been talking, but we're going to stop talking about Harry and Kes, finally, and talk about the episode, The Gift. Let's talk about X-Men First Class. I'm going somewhere with this, I swear. In X-Men First Class, Eric Lehnsherr has been having a horrible, terrible life of nightmarish disgustingness, and has been brutalized and broken and beaten, and the one individual who is actually able to get through to him and reach him and really connect with him to the point where the two are basically best friends, even when they are opponents, is Charles Xavier. Now, why is that? Is it because Charles Xavier is really smart? No. Is it because he has mental powers? No. Is it because of similarity situation? God, no. Charles actually came from a privileged lifestyle. The reason why is because Charles Xavier had one thing that was kind of unique to him in the X-Men universe, especially as presented in the movies, but this is true in the comics as well, at least several versions of the comics, because of course you can't just say the comics, there's like 5 or 6 different... Anyways. And that is the ability to unconditionally love. Now, I'm not implying any gay romantic thing here. Not that I'm saying that would be necessarily a bad thing. But in all seriousness, that kind of unconditional agapeo, if I could use such a term, is something that is kind of rare in characters, especially in fiction, but I mean, that's true in real life as well. How often do you meet someone who is willing to be completely open and completely honest and just care about you, genuinely show real compassion and sympathy and empathy and caring for you, even though you are lashing out at them, even though you are hurting them, they still just open their arms and show you how much they care. That's why I use the word love, because in my opinion, that is an accurate usage of the word. One of the 3 definitions of the word love, I might add. So, which is why I used agapeo there. So, Charles Xavier was uniquely situated to get through to Eric Lehnsherr because he so embraced him. And it takes that kind of ability to reach out even when the other person isn't reaching back. It's very difficult to do. And it's not always possible. And it's not always going to succeed. And you're almost assuredly going to get hurt in the process. This is exactly what 7 of 9 needed. This is what 7, I should say, what 7 needed. I gotta get my terms straight, because there's Annika, 7 of 9, and 7. I'm going to try to be uniform about using these terms throughout the course of the rest of this video. And by this video, I mean this video series. 7 needed someone who was willing to be the Xavier to her, who was willing to reach out and take care of her, even though they were hurt. And I mention this because it's also very understandable why she didn't get that. I could talk for literally hours about the plight of 7, and to use my terminology correctly here, the new person, the new being, burdened with all of the baggage of Annika Hansen and 7 of 9, and the specious and frankly understandable racism, I hate to use the word racism, prejudice, against her because of her nature and what she was and what she did. The idea of what was accomplished in the past. We will see so many of the crew member over the course of the next year just berate her and bash her and shove things in her face that she generally probably does not actually want to have shoved in her face. And this won't even get better for a while, I feel like pointing out. I mean, this is a significant thing for quite a bit of time at how much the crew just basically berates and is belligerent towards 7. But I mentioned it's understandable why they are that way. Because of course they are. It is very human, forgive me for the misnomer here, to act around. So, I mean, on the one hand, logically, intellectually, you know that she was not to blame for what was done. And yet the emotional punch of what the Borg are. That's one of the true threats of the Borg, if you'll forgive me for being blunt. Not just what they can do, but what they engender in others. The fear, the anger, the horror. The amount of emotion that the Borg cause in other beings is monumental. It's through the roof, if I can be blunt. And so, the idea that they would be so... I mean, the thing is, if you notice, they never really step over the line with regards to her. At least, that's by memory. If I find myself wrong as we're going through this series, I'll point it out. But by memory, they never step over the line. They never literally are actually violent. They never try to string her up. They never try to stone her to death. They never try to do any of those things that real-life humans have done for the same basic reasons, and indeed much, much worse reasons. So that intellectual understanding is still there of the fact that she is not actually to blame, but they cannot seem to overcome that emotional connection of the fact that she was Borg. And proud of it, I might add. And the fact that she would... I don't want to get too much into this, but it's no wonder that 7 would eventually develop a pride in her Borg past, partially as a defense mechanism against these people who are so antagonistic towards her, and partially because the fact that the Borg, all their horribleness aside, can accomplish great things. They truly are a juggernaut in more than one way, scientifically, militarily, in terms of resources and production and spread, and dozens and dozens of other different ways. So it's understandable that the crew did not give her what she needed, but it is also fully understandable that she needed that. I find myself wondering what Seven would have developed into if the crew had all been that Xavier for her. Now, I know what you're going to say. I'm going to talk about that later, so just bear with me for a moment. The other thing I find interesting, I keep looking at my notes. I actually wrote the number 7 because it's quicker, right? And I keep looking and think, what is that? I'm going to have to get used to that. We also see in this episode the beginning of Janeway's misunderstandings of Seven. The fact that she doesn't fully understand what's in front of her. I only want to mention this because I want it to be in the back of your mind over the course of quite a while, several episodes, until it has a rather dramatic payoff later on. So just keep that in the back of your mind. This is the beginning of Janeway seeing Annika Hansen, not Seven. And she emphasizes that several times. So I also want to mention a couple things about Kes, because this is how the episode goes, back and forth between Seven and Kes. The level of precision in being able to remove an implant on a nerve. Do you know how big a nerve is? I'll give you a hint, it's not very large. The level of precision required to do that without damaging the nerve is interesting and amazing, and also really appropriate if you think about it. At no point did I think, oh yeah, right, because Kes has always had, as I mentioned before, that very precise analytical mind, that perfect memory, that ability to learn and adapt so quickly and functionally. She has always actually been basically genius-level IQ. It is only her nature and her personality that prevent her from having the other foibles that genius-level IQ usually reaches. This is, of course, my opinion and my analysis, and I'm actually going somewhere with this, which I'll talk about later. But just keep that in the back of your mind as well for the Kes thing. I'm going to have your mind full, hopefully, by the time I'm done here. It also is another thing that I like because of the fact that it shows how unique Seven really is. Or in other words, the question could be asked, well, if we could just detach her, Seven, from the collective, why can't we do that to all the drones? Well, you can't. Seven was barely salvaged, and only then because Kes was there. If not for Kes's intervention, if not for the lengthy and extensive efforts that Janeway went through, Seven would not have been redeemed. She would not have been saved. She would have died. Kes was able to do what the Doctor was incapable of doing. Now, yes, you could argue that the Doctor might have been able to salvage it, but based on his tone, and props to Robert Picardo for this, his tone, his posture, and the way he approaches, he sees this as his entire approach is, I'm about to lose a patient, not I have to work to save a patient. There's a subtle difference there, and he manages to pull off that difference brilliantly. So I'm of the opinion that, yeah, Seven would have died if not for Kes. They don't have Kes anymore. Think about that. I also find it curious, and indeed, I would go so far as to put this, under my speculation, that it is basically Tuvok's. It is because of Tuvok that Kes was able to mutate so quickly and powerfully, because what he gave her is something that is often underestimated in Star Trek. The Vulcans are a lot of things across the various Star Trek series. But one thing I feel that has always remained a constant when they are written properly, cough, cough, Enterprise, cough, cough, is that the Vulcans have a tremendous amount of mental discipline. They know how to keep their thoughts reined, they know how to focus, they know how to concentrate, they know how to meditate properly. For those of you who don't know, meditating is all about concentration and absentia of random thoughts. Focusing your thoughts, or indeed trying to think nothing, which is also very, very difficult to do. So I felt that the inclusion of that Vulcan mental discipline into Kes and the way he trains her and the way he works with her, I feel like that's one of the biggest reasons why Kes expanded and grew so powerfully and so quickly, was because of the inclusion of that discipline, which she was already working with, by the way. Don't forget. This is the kind of thing she'd done before, and her natural powers, which, again, I'll be talking about later. Keep it back there. Just an interesting thought here, food for thought. Janeway, in my opinion, has always kind of approached Kes as the motherly situation. She's always been the mother to Kes, whereas Doctor's always been the father to Kes. Both of those sides of this relationship are actually shown in this episode. I'm going to talk about the Janeway one first, because it is an interesting thing, and I feel like it was done on purpose, because the writers mentioned something similar in their interviews, of Janeway is losing one daughter, and then so she tries to gain another. In other words, obviously, she loses a daughter and gains another. That is actually what happens. But my point is, in character, I wonder if Janeway, who was losing who was goozing and getting further and further away from Kes, would have been more inclined to show all that motherly affection towards Seven as a result of that. Debatable. Very debatable, because she made the breakthrough with Seven before she really found out Kes was leaving. But it is an interesting concept because that sensation, that theme of loss and gain, the gift, appropriately named episode, is still there throughout. So I think that might have been more the writer's intention rather than actual in-character presentation. I have difficulty blaming Seven for her decision to return to the collective. The way she says it is beautiful. There was no deception. I had no intention to harm you. I saw a chance to return to the collective, and I took it. It's hard to blame her for that because she's only interacted with Janeway at this point, who has been a little bit too harsh. You know, she has not been showing that affection, that compassion, that agapeo I mentioned earlier. Taurus, who was outright, you know, and Harry Kim. No offense to Harry Kim, but especially at this point in time, the man could be defined by the word awkward. So given that that is the sole totality of her interaction with individuals, now that she is Seven, it's not really that surprising that she would, at the first chance and possibility, say, oh, heck with this, I'm out of here. As I've talked about in other videos that will be going live sometime around now-ish, this week, next week, I don't know when the schedule, I can look here. Looks like that will actually have been last Friday is when that video went live. It gets better later is not actually that feasible of an excuse when it comes to certain things, especially someone as emotionally and mentally traumatized as Seven is. One of the nice touches in this episode, and this was done deliberately, by the way, so props to that, is at several key junctures, Seven, especially about the middle of the show, Seven starts switching back and forth between saying we and I. And it's always done properly. Whenever she's saying I or me or whatever, you know, singular, she is saying something about her intentions, the intentions of Seven, the growing being that is there. Whenever she says we or us, she is basically, as a defensive mechanism, trying to resist that idea and trying to cling to that which she knows. So in both cases, it's not a mistake. It's very well done subtlety to showcase how much of a conflict is going on within her. And again, Jerry Ryan does a great job of it because her tone barely changes between we and I, and yet the words she's speaking change significantly, such that we understand that conflict that's going on within her. A conflict that she, as a new individual, barely has the ability to express. In fact, if I could skip ahead just a little bit, I think the best way that that conflict is expressed is when she just starts muttering to herself a single word over and over. One. Seven asks what I call an armor-piercing question, and I call that because I rate TV tropes. They came up with it, not me. She asks this armor-piercing question of Janeway, and I feel like this is the second of Janeway's faults in this episode. The first was she was trying too much to treat Seven like it was someone she could order around, a member of her crew, trying to be the captain to her. Now, I'm not saying that that is wrong. Quite the contrary. That is absolutely correct. That's what I would have done, too, if I was writing this episode. Janeway doesn't know how to deal with Seven, so she approaches her with the captain mentality, the distant, I'm ordering you around thing. That didn't work. So next time she tries to lay down the law and try to just be, you know, logic, reason her way through to her. That doesn't work because then Seven smashes her right back in the face with it and basically defeats her at a logic battle in the discussion that happens in the brig. Seven asks her, if I am to become, or we, I forget how she says it, but, you know, if I am to become an individual, become human, and under those circumstances, having been freed of all that has happened, if with my free will I choose to go back to the Borg, will you let me? And you could just see Janeway's reaction. She doesn't actually answer the question, by the way. Wonderful little subtlety. She just says, I don't think that's what you'd choose, or something to that effect. Brilliantly done, and especially important because, number one, Janeway takes that as basically a slap in the face. Not a deliberate slap in the face, but more of a, I have failed kind of a thing. And we've already seen Janeway does not react well to the possibility of failure. It's another nugget to keep in the back of your mind. The idea that Janeway does not cope with failure very well. We also saw this in Scorpion Part 2, by the way. But the fact that, she would probably not let Seven do that, and Seven then just basically crushes her, again, logically, you are no different than the Borg. And Janeway has no response to that because she knows she's right. Interesting little interaction there. Then we move to a great scene between Kes and Neelix. I know this sounds weird because I'm so often against the idea of splitting a story into an A-plot and the B-plot, especially when the two have basically nothing to do with each other. But in my opinion, the A-B format actually works really well with this episode. Each A-plot scene has enough time and attention focused on... I mean, it literally is a 50-50 split. We see Seven for this chunk, and Seven and Janeway, really. And we see Kes for this chunk, and her interactions with everyone else. And there's one little fulcrum point. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I like the fact that they present it as each side is equally important. Each plot is equally important. Each plot has just as much time and attention done to it. Each plot has as much character focus and development. And this is really important. They actually almost accomplished the impossible by forcing there to not be a ship is in danger plot in this episode. Obviously they failed because the ship's in danger at the end, because Kes is going to de-warp it. I don't know what to call that. But they did try. By God, they tried. They wanted this to be another family. They wanted this to be just a purely character piece. And with that one little exception, which I'm willing to let slide, The Gift is a full character piece. It is all about the characters. There's no big, oh my God, there's no technobabble, there's none of that stuff. It's just all about their interactions. And I like the fact that on both sides they get to interact with multiple characters, which brings me to the next scene, Kes and Neelix. The Kes and Neelix scene is amazing, in my opinion. It really shows the chemistry between the two actors, and just makes it more of a shame that they didn't do more with them, other than, they're in a relationship, followed by, they're not in a relationship. Off camera. But the way that Kes says that word, I mentioned the L word earlier, love. It's actually quite rare in Star Trek for the word love to be used, if you ever noticed that. Not counting the original season. Excuse me, the original series, where they tossed it around a bunch, because it was the 60s. But in all seriousness, throughout TNG, throughout DS9, throughout Voyager, the word love is not actually used that often. And I kind of like that, because the more you use a word rarely, the more emphasis it has, because you have increased the contrast to it, right? Because it's such an occurrence, such a rarity. I mention that because that really struck me in this scene, where she actually admits flat out that she loves him. And she always will. And Neelix just, like, doesn't know how to deal with that. And he reacts the way, of course he does. He always has. He reacts by joking and just kind of trying to shrug it off and make a laugh about it, because he doesn't want her to see how much he is bothered by that fact. And you could see that he can't bring himself to admit that he also will, very likely, always love her too. Great scene. And it's all just about the characters. Love that stuff. I eat it up. I eat it up. Episodes like The Gift are one of the reasons why I do genuinely like Voyager, by the way, in case you were wondering. So, a couple things here. I mentioned this here because this is when it occurred to me to be best to mention it. The whole Kes's discipline, mutation, genius level IQ, etc., etc. I have a theory. This is actually a new theory to this show. I have not had this theory prior. And I've discussed Voyager a lot because I'm a total geek. See, Klingon shirt, once again. So, the idea that if... I'm just going to toss the theory out there, okay? What if the Ocampa are a larval form? What if that would not explain everything about the way their species functions? What if they are birthed with this amazing potential? I mean, there's still holes in this, don't mistake me, because, let's be honest, the real answer here is the Ocampa were poorly thought out and are kind of a dumb species when you come down to it. But what if there is a reasoning behind this? What if the Ocampa always had the potential to be these energy beings? What if these energy beings were existing on this new plane of life, new plane of existence? I mean, this is kind of a thing that's common to Star Trek, has been since the original series. So the idea of this being, an energy being, is not unheard of. It would explain why they have such short lifespans. It would explain why they have such weird reproductive methods. But most importantly of all, it kind of ties in with something that came up all the way back in Caretaker that they actually bring up in this episode. That the Caretaker was holding them back. that the reason that they were so ruined, so stagnant, and so culturally dead was because the caretaker was keeping them in a box and therefore not allowing them to receive the stimulus they required in order to develop their both minds and then mental powers and then make that last jump into energy being like Kes does. It also would kind of explain why Kes goes through this transformation early, at a mere 3.5 or so, I guess it would be 4 at this point, about 4 years old, give or take, because of the fact that she had that extensive psionic contact with a very powerful psionic species, the Undine, right? So it makes a degree of sense. Now, again, this still has holes. Of course it does. It's a theory of mine to explain the stupidity of the writers, but it was a thought that really kept me going, and I'd love to hear you guys' comments and thoughts on it, because, yeah, it would also kind of tie in with what Suspiria was doing. Also holding them back by by giving them fake freedom. She was holding them back, as opposed to by putting them in a gilded cage. Different approaches there. Janeway is at the center of both A and B plots of this episode, the Seven and the Kes plot. But the interesting thing is, that's the obvious answer. She's the mother of both characters, right? And yet there's one other character who is at the center of both plots, who has a ton of screen time in this episode. And when I was rewatching this, I found myself surprised because I actually forgot how much screen time he had. I'm referring, of course, to the Doctor. And it makes a lot of sense, though, when I started thinking about it. Of course the Doctor has tons of screen time. Of course he is the fulcrum of these two plots. Really, he is. Kes and the Doctor's stories have been interwoven since, like, the second episode. Seriously. All the way back in I can't remember the name of it. The one right after Caretaker. They have been... She is the reason he has developed so well and so quickly. And he is the reason that she has had such access to expand her horizons medically and emotionally, right? The two of them have helped each other to develop over the years, and in many ways he has always been something of a father figure to her. And I talked about this before, too, with regards to several other episodes. On the other hand, we have Seven, the only person capable of interacting with her as if she was a person and not a ex-Borg, is the Doctor. He's the only one who looks at her and treats her like her, rather than what they want them to be, Janeway, or what they used to be, everyone else. And the Doctor also is kind of crucial to the Seven plot because he's the Doctor. He is actually really, really advanced even by this point. He is basically better than his program ever intended him to be because he's been running for 3+ years, with the exception of the one reboot he had. So all that knowledge and experience is helping him in order to work with something as incredibly advanced and sophisticated as the Borg. The obvious pride he shows at how much work and attention to detail and all this fun stuff that he's been doing to help her recover. The joy on his face is palpable. And you could see that pride in that and in her, which also makes it obvious why he would connect with her, and somewhat perplexing that he kind of doesn't. I'll talk more about this later. Suffice it to say, I've always felt the Doctor and Seven should have had much more of an interesting and close relationship over the course of the series. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now. One quick note. When Seven is in the brig that last time, and she literally breaks down, Janeway comes down to see her, and this is the third attempt she's made. I mentioned before, she tried to be the captain, she tried to try the tough love thing. It's failed. So Janeway comes down there, and you can almost see it in the way she's acting. This is almost an act of desperation. She knows this probably won't work. She knows she'll be hurt by it, but she reaches out to Seven nonetheless. She genuinely reaches out to her, and she is hurt, physically hurt in the interaction. And yet, perfectly, she does not react to that. She does not lash out or violent or push her away. She accepts that pain and continues to embrace Seven. She holds her to her chest and just tries to comfort her. Remember what I said earlier about the Xavier factor? And how that's what people like that need? It is no wonder that Janeway did finally break through to Seven, because she was finally willing to do what Seven actually needed. What Seven probably had been wanting without knowing or realizing it, having no experience with this kind of thing, since the beginning of this episode. She needed someone to just plain be there for her, and to really demonstrate through action that caring they had of her, And the way Janeway walked into that cell room, the way that Janeway handed out to her, the way that Janeway took the hit and then continued to console her, that was exactly what was needed. That scene was brilliant, and I do not have shame in admitting that I actually cried rewatching that scene, because it was exactly what it should have been. And it is fascinating to me that if you look at Janeway's face, you can see how shocked she is that this has worked out, that this has happened this way, that this is what worked. The scientist and the captain both are baffled because it was the human who actually succeeded. Couple of last notes. There's a brilliant scene pretty much right after this between Kes and Janeway, where they basically say goodbye. For those of you who don't know, this was insisted upon by both actresses, but the writers also wanted it in because, again, even from the writer's perspective, Janeway's always been the mother, the surrogate mother to Kes. If you rewatch that, I say this every now and again, rewatch the scene. Please, rewatch this scene, okay? I'm begging you. Those tears, I mean, watch their expressions, watch their face, listen to their voices. The actresses were actually crying during that scene. That was not faked. That was not acted. The reason it feels so genuine is because it was. Kate Mulgrew was really genuinely sad to see Jennifer go, and vice versa. The two had always gotten along really, really well off the camera, off the set. And the two of them were really sad to see each other go. Mulgrew actually treated her to this big goodbye dinner, which was basically just the two of them, and how Mulgrew was so hopeful that Jennifer would go out and get this big career and how it's going to be this amazing thing. And they were just genuinely tearing, genuinely crying at this loss. It's understandable why, though, if you think about it. It's hard not to get attached to someone you work so closely with for so long. There's a reason why the Deep Space Nine's final episode and all the massive, massive amount of epilogue in that episode was considered mandatory, because the actors insisted on it. They knew they weren't going to be really seeing each other or talking with each other or otherwise being with these people who they'd shared 7 years of their lives with ever again. Or at the very least, uncommonly, you know. A lot of those tears were genuine, too. And you know, it's hard to explain what that feels like if you haven't felt it yourself, so forgive me for tearing up again a little bit. But it's a beautiful scene, and that's why I wanted to comment on that. Two final notes, I swear. Two final notes. The idea of jumps, I know this is like way off topic compared to everything I've been talking about, because it's all been character stuff up to this point. The idea of jumps, in my opinion, was a good idea. Let me explain what I mean. When I say jumps, this is their journey. You know, they're up here, they're going here. Jump. Jump. People have actually done the math and figured out that by all the jumps they did, Voyager was actually stupidly close to home by the end of season 7. But that's getting off topic, and that's a little nitpicky. The point is, the idea of jumps is a good one in my opinion. It's the kind of thing I feel like the show should have done more of, and will do more of from this point on, I might add. Instead of, you know, the 70-year journey, it's the kind of a journey, as you find more and more ways to catapult yourself closer to home. Granted, I'm also the guy who, in my rewritten version of Voyager, for the Imperium's version of Voyager, had them actually get home in, I forget which season exactly. It was the end of season 4 or the beginning of season 4. I forget which. I'd have to re-look at my notes. And then continue the story from that point, with the vastly changed Alpha-Beta quadrants, the post-Dominion War, etc. So, you know, but I still think that's a really good idea from them, logistically speaking, because it gives a tangible sense of progress to the viewers, and it gives them an idea that this is not TNG 2.0. The idea of actually making big jumps home makes it so instead of just, we're having adventures in space, just like TNG was a lot of season 6 and 7, it gets back to, instead, we are actually trying to get home. And again, that sense of progress. We are succeeding at getting home. It's also one of the reasons why the "will they get home yet? No" plot was basically dropped from this point on. Instead, they actually had a new subplot, which will be starting up very soon here. Message in a Bottle basically starts that subplot, which in my opinion works much, much better. So, good move forward. Final note, final note. The codas. There are actually 2 codas in this episode, appropriately. One is for 7, and one is for Kes. The 7 one, it concludes the Doctor and Janeway, because of course it does, and also has a wonderful little line. Red. Her color. Her favorite color. And again, not my. Her favorite color was red. That one little line speaks volumes. It means she does remember. It means there are bits and pieces of Annika Hansen in the new creature. And it means there is room for development and growth. It gives us a bit of hope that Seven, the new being, will be her own person. And then the last one has no lines at all because it doesn't need it. Tuvok and the little candle. It's the same prop, by the way, the one they've been using, he and Kes have been using several times previous to this. And he just lays it by the window. And you can just tell there's no words needed. You can see the honor that he's putting out there. You can see the memorialization of it. And it was a nice touch, too, and a very needed touch because it was needed for us, the fans, as well. Because Jennifer Lean, if I'm saying her name right, is gone. Kes is gone. They needed to have that last little touching goodbye. No words are needed for that. And I know I said only had 2 points left, but this is the last point, I swear. They actually developed a brand new CGI model of Voyager for that last shot. And I mention this because, obviously that was a good thing in general, because they wanted the full CGI model of Voyager anyways for the future. There's a lot of good uses for having a very high-detailed Voyager model. If you don't know what I mean by this, if you make a model of something and you know it's only going to be seen at like this distance, you know what, here. Let me grab the hammer here. If you're only ever seeing the hammer like out here, when you're designing this model, you don't have to go into all these little details that are actually on this model, because it's only going to be seen at this distance and zooming by, right? That's just logical. If, however, you're going to do a super close-up, and I know this is just fuzzy and you can't tell what I'm looking at better, but if you're going to do something like that, you need all that detail to be there. So they went back and, over the course of several months, weeks, wow, not months, this was done during the summer, worked on this whole incredibly detailed model of Voyager to be used basically from now on in. And it was done so they could do this pull-out shot from Voyager. And the reason they went to so much effort and length was, again, to honor the passing of Kes and the fact that she was leaving the show. So really well done stuff, in my opinion. Great episode, great episode. My throat hurts. I'll see you guys next time.
You've lived most of your life here. Voyager has been your home. And you've been a vital part of this family. Oh, I'm gonna miss you.